Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
Dr. Fenwick, it's a real honor and privilege to interview you today. So thank you for agreeing to join us on the Science and Wisdom Live event.
That's a great pleasure.
Wonderful. And as we start, I want to thank you because, in exploring the work that you've been doing for so many decades and the dedication that you've had in exploring consciousness from many different perspectives. First of all, of course, as a scientist, and hopefully we'll also talk about in this dialogue a little bit. You yourself are a meditator, and in your work as a scientist, you've been studying the NDEs, which we'll talk about, and you've also been studying more recently transcendental experiences, which is fascinating. So we're really, really honored to have you here today. Thank you. So let's jump a little bit in the deep end. So in an interview that you've given, you talked about something you called Freud's paradox, which is basically explains that whilst people find it really hard to speak about their own death, they can actually really easily imagine and find it easy to talk about other people's death. So in your experience, what is the source of this fear of death? Is it something that is more of a modern phenomenon, or is it something that's been part of us from the beginning? What is your perspective on that?
I think it's been with us for a very long time. Freud said, as you correctly pointed out, that we're very happy to talk about other people's death, but never our own. And if you go, supposing you're at a party and you say to somebody, tell me, when are you going to die? They'll say, excuse me, I have to just go and talk to somebody else. Can't bear it. Terrible thing. And it's called the existential fear of death. And it's so strong. It changes our behavior. I'll give you some examples of this. But first of all, let me tell you about, I don't think you can see this. Has that come up the right way for you?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
It's a book. It's The Worm at the Core. And the core, of course, is an apple. And the worm is the existential fear of death. It goes all the way through. And it's by Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Szynski. I would really get this book because it tells you an awful lot about the fear of death. They talk about some experiments in it, and there's one experiment which I like, and there are many of them. They got two groups of judges. Now, judges, mark you, not ordinary people, judges. And they gave them all a questionnaire to show that their personalities were the same. And then they, on one group of judges, they added one extra question, which was a very simple one. When do you think you're going to die? Now, this immediately struck up in those judges their existential fear of death. Astonishing. So they then gave both groups of judges independently a case to judge. And the case to judge was a fairly ordinary one. A lady had been out in the night collecting customers, and the police had taken her in, and she was before the magistrates. And they were asked, as a judge, what sentence they would give her. And so they asked the first group of judges that had not had the question what punishment they'd give this lady. They said, oh, well, we think sort of $50 is what would be about right. It's what's usually given. And they're all judges, okay? Now, the second group who'd had the question discussed it amongst themselves, knowing what they'd been told about a $50 fine. And they came up with a fine of $450. And when asked why, they said, well, it's the most disgusting thing to do. I don't think she should have done it. And so we'll have to fine her heavily for this. Now, that's amazing, absolutely amazing. And what was the difference? The difference was that they'd had their existential fear of death stimulated. And so you can see straight away that it's absolutely foundational to us. Now, are there any countries in the world where the existential fear of death is to some extent mitigated or mediated? And the answer is yes, Bhutan. And in Bhutan, nobody would mind if I go up to them and say, hi, when are you going to die? They wouldn't mind. They wouldn't immediately rush off and become existentially afraid, because death, and everybody's death, is commonly discussed. And the Bhutanese say that if you are reminded 5 times a day about your own death, then you lose to some extent your existential fear of death. Now, that's something we can all do. And I know that all of you love your telephones. I'm sure you're all Gen Z. There's a nice app for you. And the app is called We Croak. We Croak. And 5 times a day, it will send you a message reminding you of your own death. And so you'll become used to the idea that you're going to die.
That's so great. That will be very popular amongst Buddhists, especially who are encouraged to remember their own death many, many times a day.
Okay. Well, there you are. 5 times a day, and the app is We Croak. And it's free, what's more. So you can get rid of your existential fear of death quite easily.
And of course, you've spent decades talking to and studying people who've had near-death experience, and in your work, you talk about how this seems to stimulate a kind of a process of inner transformation of those who have gone through these experiences. So would you talk to us a little bit about that, what people gain through their near-death experiences, and how that seems to be a positive, transformative process for people?
Yes, interesting. I mean, it's all so interesting. Near-death experiences, to begin with, I thought were rubbish, absolute rubbish. Who's ever heard of people leaving their bodies when they're dead and looking at them, and they're going down a tunnel and into a magic realm? Must be rubbish. And so I read Moody's book, Life After Life, and realized that this only happened in California, nowhere else. And so it certainly wouldn't cross the channel, I mean, the Atlantic, and come to the UK. But I was so wrong, because soon after this, a patient walked into my consulting room. He'd had a failed cardiac catheter at another hospital, and he'd had a near-death experience. So, I mean, I couldn't any longer say this doesn't occur, because it did. but it gave me the chance to be able to study it and see what I thought of it. And so I talked to him a lot about his near-death experience and what he saw. And essentially, it was what Moody described. And I wrote 1 or 2 short articles, and I wrote an article for the Times. And the BBC got hold of this and said, would I like to commentate a program called Glimpses of Death? And I said, yes, of course I would love to do that. And so that was aired, and it was all about near-death experiences. And we then got 2,000 letters. Do you remember letters? Things that you slit with a knife and take something out instead of click on. And so we had 2,000 of these. They were a lovely record. We were able to sort them out, and we took 500 of the ones which were giving a really good description of a near-death experience. So that was our database. And then we sent, to normalize the data, we sent around a questionnaire to all these 500 people. And we received about 450 replies in the end, which actually is not bad, because obviously these were meaningful experiences to the people, so they're happy to do that. And so we wrote our book, The Truth in the Light, on 350 of these, looking exactly at what happened, the frequency, and so on. The first thing, and do remember this, and that is that near-death experiences can happen anywhere. They can happen after cardiac arrest, and that's about, depends on the study. 4% was our study. We did another study at Southampton, and that was 7. And those who came to Pim Van Lovel's talk, he will have told you it was about 18. So there's a variable amount, but it's in that sort of range. And when we looked at who got them, certainly people who had a cardiac arrest, that wasn't difficult. People who were seriously ill, they got it. What about other people? Well, meningitis, yes. Didn't have to be pneumonia or anything like that, but any serious illness. And now we come to another group, those who think they're going to die but don't, the so-called fear-death experiences. These are people who see a car crash coming up and they know they can't avoid it. And then in the moment between when they realize this and the crash occurs, they may have a near-death experience. And then there is another group that will have it sitting in front of the fire at home. And I mean, you can't call that a near-death experience because the terminology is wrong. They're not near-death, they're comfortable looking at the fire. No, it's what you do say, it is a mystical experience. So basically, you can get them from physical causes like cardiac arrest. You can get them from extreme fear, and you can get them from mystical experience, and they all have approximately the same features. So that was the first thing we learned. And so you can't keep the stereotype, oh, he didn't have a cardiac arrest, therefore he didn't have a near-death experience. That's totally wrong. He could have done. And so what happens? Well, you all know terribly well. I'll come to your question in a moment, which is about change. The first leaving your body and seeing your body. This is not a trivial thing to do, because you see your whole body and you're up in the ceiling and you're looking down and you see your body there. Now, can you think of anything in your life that has led you to see your body independently? It doesn't occur. Or if it does, I'd be interested to hear about it. and then you go down the tunnel. What is the tunnel? Now, a tunnel is really an interesting phenomenon. It's floating down a tunnel, but the tunnel can have a structure to it, like one of the people who wrote in said hers was like the hose pipe from a washing machine, you know, the great big pipe that it vents out of, one of those sort of tunnels. And somebody else said, no, it wasn't like that at all. It was a darkness through which they were floating. And at the end of the tunnel, the end of the darkness, there is the light. Now, the people who get negative experiences, some people are terrified of floating around in the dark. I wouldn't be frightened of it now because I trust the process, and I'd encourage any of you who have it to trust the process. But you then float around, so don't be afraid, and you go to the light, and then the light has enormous qualities to it: love, care, warmth, support, all those sort of positive qualities. And it may speak to you or it may not. And if it speaks to you, it will be something you can ask a question if you like. Hey, light, what are you doing here? Somebody is said to have said, whether he said it or not, I don't know. And the light said, oh, well, what would you like? And he said, I want to see the universe. So the light took him on a tour of the universe. Now, I thought that was a rather nice thing to do. And if ever I come across the light, I shall say to him, hey, light, can you give me a tour of the universe, please?
It's a good question.
Be terrific. So, but think of it as warm, loving, kind, supportive. And you mostly, because you haven't come across this sort of thing before, will be very frightened about the whole thing. You will not be liking it. And then you leave the presence of the light and go into an English country garden. And I've been asked many times, is it always an English country garden? I mean, it seems silly to say it's an English country garden if you're in the Philippines. Why on earth should they go into an English country garden? And the answer is it's a friendly place where you're happy wandering around. And we seem to be happy in this country in an English country garden. So we wander around it a bit. About 12% of us will have a life review. Now, the life review is enormously interesting. What happens is that you're shown a piece of your behavior. Now, there's nobody there to judge you. There isn't an Überführer who looks at you and says you should not have done that. No, you're your own master, your own critic. And you see what you did is really very unpleasant. And if you do get embroiled in a fight and hit somebody, you don't see them, you see their response, but you feel your own blow. It's reflexive. And that's an astonishing thing to happen. And of course, then you'll decide, probably, I hope, that if you ever come out of this strange experience you're having, that you won't hit people in the future. And after the life review, you can get a preview of what's going to come. Like you may find that you are given a glimpse of your wife's death or a glimpse of the children that you're going to have, all that sort of thing. And it's not as common as the life review, but the preview does occur. And so you have to ask yourself a very fundamental question. Are you on a rail track? Are you, in fact, being drawn into the future, which is already known? And I'll leave that as a question for you, because we obviously don't know the answer to it. But if you just take that bit of data then it would look as if, in fact, what is going to happen is known. And so, do you have free will? If you're going to marry somebody and you know who it is, fine. If they're going to die, that doesn't involve you. But one or two things will lead you to question whether you have free will or not. And then after the life review, you come back. Now, the comeback is described usually by people as being instantaneous. You're back in your body, back in all the pain that you had before you left it. So it's a fascinating set of experiences, but is that all? No, it's not. Now I come to answer your question. And your question is, how do people change with this? How do they grow in any way? And the answer is yes, they do. And keep in mind, will you, that not only adults get near-death experiences, but children do as well. And children, in fact, morph or change in more or less the same way as adults do. And well, you know already most of the changes that occur. One is the fear of death goes. Who's going to be afraid of going through the tunnel and meeting the being of light? I mean, it's so reassuring and comforting, you wouldn't mind doing that. So you lose your fear of death altogether. And then the other thing that's terribly important is that you become a much more spiritual person. Come on, if you have found that you are leading a parallel life, which has got a spiritual component to it, won't you start seeking it out and being interested in it? Of course you will.
For sure. And it's interesting because, you know, when you describe these experiences, or when people describe these experiences as you interview them, and, you know, as you say, many of them are very pleasant and positive and expansive and connecting.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I guess one question that arises then, what makes them come back? You know, what?
Well, some don't want to. And in fact, I remember I was rung up by a GP in Wales who said one of his patients had a near-death experience. It was, in fact, in a short cardiac arrest, which was started by his heart was started again by the paramedics. And he was enormously upset by the fact, not by the fact that he had this experience or cardiac arrest, but they had taken him away from the area of this fantastic love and care. And he didn't want to come back. And Moody reported that in his book. And I had a patient in hospital. She was a young girl in her early 20s, and she'd had a near-death experience. And all she wanted to do was to get back. And she came into hospital because she wanted to kill herself. And so the nurses, of course, would take everything away from her. She couldn't have a dressing gown cord, for example. And she was monitored very closely to begin with. And then finally, after a period of psychotherapy, she come to understand that she, in fact, had got a much greater purpose than going back into the light. And she decided to live and was able to leave hospital. So not everybody is pleased that they have to come back. Some would like to stay.
One of the reasons why, you know, this is, of course, so fascinating is that it confronts us with this, you know, the problem of the brain and the consciousness, the relationship between the brain and the consciousness. And how is it that there can be this very lucid consciousness that can be experienced when the brain is experiencing this loss of function? And although, as you say, you know, near-death experience or fear-death experiences don't necessarily arise when the brain is non-functioning. So there can be different circumstances, but nonetheless. And so, as you mentioned before, Geshe Namdak was in dialogue with Pim van Lommel, really recently. And of course, Pim van Lommel, in his work, has now describes, consciousness, or his conclusion, so to speak, of all of his research is that consciousness, that near-death experience show that the continuity of consciousness, and that consciousness is non-local. I'd be interested to hear for you, what does a near-death experience say in terms of the nature of consciousness?
Yes, okay. Well, the nature of consciousness is, as Chalmers says, it's the hard problem. You can take two views. Dan Dennett says consciousness is generated in the brain. I think there is absolutely no evidence to support that at all. Of course, the only way that we can know that we're conscious, that somebody else is conscious, is either by watching their behavior or what they tell us. And behavior is controlled by the brain. What they tell us is of their own internal state. And so it's a brain function. And then it says, go home. That's the whole thing answered. It's nothing more than brain function. But this is so untrue, because look at what consciousness does. It's non-local. In other words, it's distributed throughout the universe, or seems to be. And there are so many non-local experiences which suggest that it's not limited to the brain, and so on. There's all the non-local effects of consciousness, which suggests that it's not just a brain-based thing. But remember that anybody who says that consciousness is constructed by the brain is just taking an older view of science. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just the science they use to explain consciousness. If you believe that the world is made up of physical particles and you can reduce everything to physical particles, and when you start to try to reduce consciousness to physical particles, you can't do it. So you say it's an illusion. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's just incorrect. There's no way of saying wrong.
And yet this materialistic view is prevalent, it seems, in the scientific community. And many scientists, of course, find it difficult to accept the possibility of experience without this brain activity. And you've been wrestling with this for decades now, studying this for decades. How do you think, looking forward, looking into the future, how do you think this paradigm will shift in the following decades?
Yeah,
if it will it shift? What do you think?
I don't know. I think it's a really interesting question. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the scientific and medical network is to try and give this aspect of science a little push. And we have something called the Galileo Commission, in which people, scientists, respected scientists, who understand about non-locality and the wider view of consciousness on the commission. I think, look at it this way. If you are a reductionist, then you are excluding a whole lot of things from your lexicon. If there is clear telepathy, then you describe it as hallucination. And if there is clear evidence of healing at a distance, you say that this is local healing due to your imagination. Do you see? you find a physical basis for everything, or say it doesn't exist, and it produces a very limited world. It's not a world that I'd like to live in. On the other hand, if one sees consciousness as being part of the universal structure, then it's very different. And this then goes to the idea of what's going to happen to you. What is a human being? Because this is really what we're asking. Is a human being just meat, which will in fact be eaten by worms if they're given a chance? If not, it'll go up in smoke. Or is the human being something different? My own view on this, and I do it, and I come to this view really because of the experiences I have, is that there is a divine component to everybody. And when Lawrence van der Post was asked, do you believe in God? He said, no, I don't believe in God. I know, because he too had the sort of experiences that most of us have, and where we in fact can see a more transcendent component of ourselves. But I would have a lot of difficulty going on to a grand round in the Maudsley and saying, hey guys, I'm not just meat. There's something rather special within me. You wouldn't say that.
What would happen if you did? How would they react?
Well, they probably know me.
Yeah, I know.
Probably say, oh God, do we have to listen to this?